When I first moved into the sinking village, I thought the bell was just a quaint local tradition, a call to supper, or maybe a warning for fishermen to come ashore. It wasn't until my second night that I understood how absolute it was. An old man in a faded wool coat paused on the path, gripping my arm harder than I thought his frail hands could, and said in a voice that carried both fear and reverence, "Rule 1. Boy, never stay outside after the first chime of the evening bell." His eyes flicked toward the horizon, where the sun was folding itself into the sea, and in that brief moment, I saw something ripple along the cobblestone street, like the air itself bending away from the light. I laughed it off then, but when the bell rang and the air grew heavy, I ran inside without thinking, the echo following me like a warning that had been whispered for generations. The house I'd inherited from my great-uncle was perched at the edge of the village, its slanted roof leaning toward the sinking marshes. Inside, the wood smelled of brine and smoke, a reminder that the sea had never truly been a neighbor, more like a quiet predator. The windows rattled with the faint hum of the bell's second chime, though the sound came from the center of town. I pressed my ear to the glass and could hear faintly a sloshing in the distance, not the tide but something heavier, deliberate. I told myself it was just the wind pushing through the marsh channels. Still, I caught myself checking the front doors locked twice, then thrice, feeling the same instinct a sailor feels before a storm, an unspoken rule to shut yourself away before the water starts moving in ways it shouldn't. By the third night, curiosity pressed against my chest like a weight. I wanted to know what happened outside after the bell. The villagers didn't speak openly about it, but their silences said enough. In the market, when I asked a woman selling dried fish if anyone ever stayed out past the first chime, she dropped her gaze to her hands and muttered that those who do aren't from here anymore. The phrasing clung to me, not that they were gone, but that they were no longer the people they had been. My great-uncle's journals, dusty and cracked in the attic, mentioned the same phrase in shaky pen strokes. He wrote about figures moving through the flooded streets, their steps careful, as if they didn't want the water to hear them. And always, there was the reminder, Rule 1 must be obeyed without hesitation. The fourth night, I made the mistake of losing track of time. A thick fog rolled in from the marshes, curling around the houses and smothering the sunset in a gray blanket. I was outside repairing the fence when the first chime sounded, low and hollow, its vibration slipping into the bones of the earth. My head snapped up, and I realized I could no longer see the end of the street. The air smelled of salt and something faintly metallic, like wet coins. I sprinted for the front door, my boots slapping the wet stone, and in that moment, I heard it, not footsteps, but the displacement of water, slow and steady, matching my pace. When I slammed the door behind me, I thought I heard something brush against the outside wall, a sound like kelp dragged along wood. The days remained normal, almost absurdly so, with children playing along the seawall and fishermen mending their nets under the sun. But each evening, the shadows stretched faster, eager to swallow the narrow lanes. I began to notice subtle changes, the waterline creeping higher on the buildings, salt stains marking doors that had once been dry, and most unsettling of all, shapes half hidden in the shallows that didn't match the rhythm of the waves. It became a ritual for me: lock the door, draw the curtains, light a single oil lamp, and sit in the living room with the faint echo of the bell still ringing in my skull. Whatever happened outside after dark, I knew one thing: Rule 1 wasn't a suggestion. It was a line drawn between life and whatever waited in the drowned streets. The first time I heard them, I thought it was just the wind shaking the shutters loose. I had been sitting in the kitchen, with a cup of tea gone cold, the lamplight trembling from the draft, when the sound came: 3 deliberate knocks against the front door. My great-uncle's journals had mentioned visitors, but I'd assumed it was metaphor, some way to describe the tide pressing against the walls. It wasn't until I found the scrawled reminder, underlined twice in ink, that I realized it was literal Rule 2. Never answer the knocks after nightfall. He hadn't said why. He hadn't needed to. Even without opening the door, I felt something on the other side, a patience that belonged to something that didn't breathe. The knocking returned the following night, but this time, it came from the back door. I hadn't used that entrance in weeks, the hinges swollen from salt and disuse, yet the knocks were slow, steady, and confident, as if the knocker knew I was standing in the hallway, holding my breath. I whispered to myself, "Don't answer, don't answer." But the urge to peek through the curtain tugged at me, like a child pulling on a parent's sleeve. Just one glance, I told myself, just to prove there's nothing there. But when I inched the fabric aside, the yard was empty. The fog, however, seemed thicker, clinging to the glass, as if it wanted to come inside. I stepped back quickly, heart pounding in my ears, and didn't notice until later that the knocks had stopped the moment I touched the curtain. The villagers never acknowledged the knocks, but I noticed the way they avoided looking at certain doors after sunset. Some homes had thick chains bolted across their frames, others nailed shut from the outside. At the tavern, an older fisherman, smelling of brine and ale, muttered something about borrowed voices to the man next to him, then caught me listening and fell silent. That phrase followed me home, circling my thoughts. When the knocks came again that night, softer this time, they were followed by a voice, my mother's voice, though she's been gone for 15 years. "It's me," it called, the tone perfect, the rhythm of her speech exactly as I remembered. I sat in the dark with my hands gripping the chair until my knuckles burned, reminding myself over and over, Rule 2 must never be broken. 3 nights later, I made my worst mistake yet. I lingered by the window too long after the knocks began. The glass fogged from my breath. This time, the voice was my own, calling from outside, saying things I'd never spoken but could have. It told me it was cold out there, that it was tired of waiting, that I should see what it had brought me. The words twisted into promises that made my skin crawl. I backed away from the window, but I swear I saw a shadow press against the door, its shape shifting as though made from water. The knocks grew louder, faster, and then stopped so suddenly that the silence felt heavier than the sound. I didn't sleep until the first light of dawn touched the floorboards. By now I've come to recognize the pattern. The knocks start faint, like the tentative tap of rain on a roof, and then grow insistent, purposeful. The voices come only after the second set of knocks, as though whatever waits outside wants you to listen first. I've learned to sit away from the doors, far from temptation, my lamp turned low so it can't see my shadow through the curtains. And still, the temptation lingers, to open, to see, to know. But the journals all agree, and the stories whispered over mugs of strong coffee all confirm it. Once you answer, the water no longer waits for the village to sink. It comes inside, and it takes you with it. That is why Rule 2 is not just survival. It's the difference between being a resident and becoming part of whatever knocks in the dark. The candlelight is the only thing that keeps the water from finding its way inside. That's what the old woman at the market told me the morning after I asked why so many houses smelled faintly of wax. She leaned across her stall, the scent of salt-dried herbs in her breath, and said quietly, "Rule 3, keep a candle burning from dusk until dawn." She didn't explain further, only handed me a stub of pale beeswax and a box of matches, as if they were medicine for a sickness I hadn't yet caught. That night, I lit it before the first chime of the bell, its thin flame shivering in the draft. The air outside pressed against the windows, heavy and damp, and though I couldn't see through the curtain, I felt it there, whatever comes with the flood. The candle's light cast thin gold lines across the walls, and the shadows beyond them didn't dare step closer. It was tempting to think the candle was just superstition, another layer of village lore meant to keep newcomers obedient. But on the 5th night, when my flame burned low, I learned otherwise. A storm had rolled in late, the wind carrying the taste of salt water far deeper inland than usual. The candle guttered once, twice, then died with a thin curl of smoke. I was halfway across the room with a fresh match when I heard it, the sound of something soft brushing against the window panes. Not knocking, not scratching, but tracing their edges like a fingertip on skin. The glass trembled under its touch. My hands shook as I relit the wick, and the moment the flame bloomed again, the sound outside stopped as if cut by a blade. My breathing was ragged in the sudden silence, and I didn't dare move until dawn. The villagers burn their candles differently. Some keep them in windows, as if the flame itself is a warning to whatever roams outside. Others place them in the center of the room, low to the floor, so the light spills in every direction. My great-uncle's journal suggested both, one to keep them away, the other to make sure they don't enter unnoticed. I've followed his advice since, and on certain nights I swear I see movement just beyond the glow, a shifting mass of dark that sways like kelp beneath the tide. It never steps into the light, but it never leaves either. I've started to think the candle isn't a barrier, it's a leash, holding the darkness at bay, but only just. One evening, curiosity got the better of me. I left the candle burning in the main room and stepped into the hallway, letting my shadow slip beyond the reach of its glow. Instantly, the air felt colder, heavier. From the corner of my eye, I thought I saw the walls ripple as if underwater. A shape formed in the dark, tall, bent, swaying slowly side to side, and when I took a step back toward the light, it followed. I didn't stop moving until my hand hovered above the candle's flame, the warmth stinging my palm, and only then did the shadow retreat. The experience left me shaking, the scent of melted wax sharp in my lungs. I slept with the lamp and candle both burning that night, their twin glows overlapping like a shield. Now every dusk, I prepare the candle with ritual precision. Fresh wick trimmed, matches laid out in reach, a second candle ready in case the first dies too soon. I've stopped asking the villagers why it works, because their answers, or their silences, frighten me more than the truth. The important thing is that it does. The water may rise, the fog may press against the glass, the knocks may come, but as long as the flame holds steady, my house remains my own. Rule 3 is the line of light between here and whatever waits outside, and I've learned not to test how thin that line truly is. When I first read this one in my great-uncle's journal, I thought it was another piece of old fisherman's logic. Perhaps the upper floors groaned in the wind, or the roof leaked when storms rolled in. But then I noticed how the villagers' bedrooms were always tucked low to the ground, often in basements or half-sunken rooms, smelling faintly of damp earth. One night, I ignored it. The air outside was thick and wet, the tide swollen from days of steady rain. But my bed upstairs was warm, and the sound of the sea through the window was almost soothing. Sometime after midnight, I woke to the sensation of weight pressing on the floorboards above me, even though there was nothing above my head but the ceiling and the roof. The creaking moved, slow and deliberate, as if something heavy was pacing directly over where I lay. The next morning, I found fine trails of water winding down the upstairs walls, glistening like veins. They weren't from the roof. The rain had stopped hours before, and the water was cold, carrying the faint smell of brine. I thought perhaps the attic was leaking, until I climbed the narrow steps and found the boards damp under my feet, slick enough to make me slip. When I crouched to touch them, the water pooled and trembled, as though it was being drawn upward from below. My great-uncle had written in uneven script, "When the tide is high, upstairs is not yours anymore." I didn't understand until that evening, when the high tide coincided with the moon's pale rise, and I heard footsteps above me again, slow and patient, the sound moving in a perfect circle. On the third night of high tide, I decided to listen from the stairs, my candle clutched in one hand. The air at the top step was colder, my breath curling visibly even though it was summer. The footsteps continued, and this time I saw a shadow stretch across the floorboards, not from my candle, but from something unseen, something moving against a light I couldn't find. The water seeped faster then, running toward me in narrow rivulets, and I felt the first drop land on my hand from above, freezing against my skin. I didn't stay to see what was casting that shadow. I fled back down, locking the stair door behind me, and didn't go back up until the tide had pulled away from the shore. The villagers don't speak openly about what happens upstairs during high tide, but I've caught them glancing at rooftops, as if expecting to see something looking back. I once asked a fisherman if the upstairs rooms ever feel different when the tide swells. He stared at me for a long time before saying, "Upstairs becomes the sea." That phrase haunted me, curling in my mind when I lay in my downstairs bed, listening to the faint creak of wood above me, the slow drip of salt water finding its way through. I thought of drowning in my sleep, without ever touching the ocean, swallowed not by waves but by the space above my head. Now, when the tide is high, I keep to the lower rooms, the ground cool beneath my feet, the candles glow steady against the damp. The upstairs door remains shut, its key cold in my pocket. Some nights I hear movement up there, not footsteps this time, but the sound of something dragging along the floor, slow and deliberate, as though testing the boundaries of the space. I imagine it tracing the lines where the walls meet, learning the shape of my home. Rule 4 keeps me anchored here, far from the reach of that upstairs tide, though I've begun to wonder what would happen if one night it decided to come down the stairs instead. I first heard this rule from a boy no older than 12, his hands buried deep in his coat pockets as he kicked pebbles along the seawall. He spoke without looking at me, as though saying it directly might invite something to listen. "Rule 5, he muttered. "Don't look at your reflection after midnight." His voice carried the kind of certainty that comes from experience, not superstition. I asked why, but he only shrugged and kept walking, leaving me with more questions than answers. That night, curiosity stalked me like a shadow, growing heavier with each passing hour. By the time the clock crept toward midnight, I found myself in the bathroom, staring into the mirror above the sink, my reflection framed by the soft flicker of candlelight. The first thing I noticed was how still my reflection was, unnaturally still. My own breathing rose and fell, my chest shifting in slow rhythm, yet the figure in the mirror seemed to pause between breaths, as if listening. I leaned closer, searching the dim outlines of my face, and that was when the reflection smiled. My mouth remained still, but the thing in the glass drew its lips into a slow, deliberate grin that didn't belong to me. The smile widened until it looked painful, stretching far beyond what skin should allow, and for a heartbeat, I thought I heard faint splashes somewhere behind the mirror, as though the glass was only a thin layer between me and deep, cold water. I stumbled back, knocking the candle to the floor, its flame sputtering but holding. The next day, I tried to dismiss it as a trick of the light, a trick of a restless mind. But in the market, I noticed how many stalls kept mirrors covered with cloth or removed entirely, their surfaces hidden away, as though they might invite danger. An older woman selling bread caught my stare and said quietly, "You only see yourself in the day. At night the sea wears your face." The phrase chilled me to the bone. That evening, I avoided the mirror entirely, washing my face in the dark, brushing my teeth without once glancing upward. Still, I felt the weight of unseen eyes in the room, patient and unblinking. A week later, the temptation returned. The house was silent, the tide high, and the urge to look into the mirror felt almost foreign, as though it were someone else's thought placed in my mind. Against my better judgment, I lit a candle and approached the bathroom. This time, the reflection was already smiling before I even reached the sink. Its head tilted slightly, its eyes brighter than mine, its mouth opening as if to speak. I didn't wait to hear what it had to say. I threw the cloth over the mirror and backed away, my pulse hammering in my ears. Even covered, I could swear I heard faint, wet breathing from behind the glass, as though something pressed its lips to the other side, waiting. Now, I keep every mirror in the house covered before sunset, a ritual as vital as lighting the candle. The fabric hangs heavy over the glass, and I never touch it until morning light floods the room. Some nights, I hear the faint creak of the mirror frame shifting, like something leaning forward from within. Rule 5 isn't about vanity or superstition. It's about keeping whatever mimics you from stepping closer. And in a village where the sea swallows streets and memories alike, I've learned there are far worse things than losing your reflection. The first time I saw it, I thought it was just one of the fishermen returning late, guiding his boat through the flooded streets after the bell. The light swayed gently, golden against the black water, and for a moment, it almost felt comforting. But then I noticed it was moving against the current, gliding silently, the water around it perfectly still, despite the tide's pull. My great-uncle's journal had a page marked in red ink, the words smudged as if written in haste. Rule 6. Never follow the lantern light into the water. It is not a fisherman, and it will not bring you back. That night, I stayed pressed against the window, watching the glow drift closer, until it stopped directly across from my door and remained there, waiting. In the morning the light was gone, but a slick trail of salt water stained the cobblestones, leading from the edge of the street to my front steps. I told myself it must have been the tide, but the water pattern was wrong. It didn't fan outward like a wave. It stretched forward in two narrow lines, almost like footprints, before vanishing beneath my door. When I asked the baker about it later, he avoided my eyes and muttered something about borrowed hands carrying the light. I wanted to press him for more, but the way his voice caught told me he had no desire to relive whatever memory he held. That evening, I made sure my curtains were shut tight. But the lantern didn't need me to look. It knew how to draw me out. 3 nights later, during the highest tide of the month, I woke to the sound of dripping inside my house. Following the faint noise, I found a small puddle forming in the hallway, glistening under the moonlight spilling through the crack in the curtain. Outside, the lantern bobbed gently on the water, its glow impossibly warm in the cold night. I felt an almost physical pull toward it, the kind of draw you feel toward a familiar voice calling your name in a crowd. My hand reached for the door without my permission, fingers brushing the lock, and it was only the sudden flicker of my candle that snapped me out of it. I stepped back into the light, trembling, as the lantern drifted slowly away, disappearing into the fog. The next morning, I found another trail of water inside, this time ending at the foot of my bed. There was no sign of forced entry, no open windows, yet the dampness was undeniable, soaking the floorboards as though the tide had risen right there in my room. I began sleeping with the candle closer to me, its light a thin shield against the temptation. I wondered if that was its trick, not to frighten, but to lure, to make you believe the water was safe, that it could carry you somewhere better. But in this village, better has never meant safer. Now when I hear the faint drip of water at night, or see the faintest shimmer through the curtains, I don't move. I stay anchored in the candle's glow, ignoring the soft sway of golden light outside. I've learned that the lantern doesn't just wait. It learns your rhythms, your weak moments, and it will always return when you are most likely to step outside. Rule 6 is simple, but breaking it means more than drowning. It means being led somewhere you cannot come back from, no matter how bright the light may seem. The first time I heard them, I thought it was just the echo of the old church bells drifting through the evening tide. But these chimes were deeper, slower, resonating, not through the air but through the water itself, a vibration that settled in my bones. I was sweeping the kitchen floor when it began, a faint hum at first, like the drone of a far-off ship's engine. Then came the distinct toll, heavy and damp, each note lingering as though dragged upward from the depths. My great-uncle's journal had scrawled warnings about the submerged bells in ink so faded, I almost missed it. They do not call the living. I didn't understand what he meant until the sound grew louder, and with it came the urge to step outside, to let the tide rise around me, and follow the vibrations to their source. That night, I made the mistake of pausing by the window, curious to see if anyone else had heard it. The streets were already submerged ankle-deep, moonlight glinting off the rippling surface. Across the way, Mrs. Hanley stood barefoot in the water, her hair floating around her shoulders as if she were already waist-deep in the sea. Her eyes were glassy, her mouth moving in perfect time with the bell tolls, though no sound left her lips. The water around her seemed to shiver in rhythm, and for a moment I thought I saw faint shapes moving beneath the surface. Not fish, not debris, but outlines of hands, dozens of them, rising toward her legs. She stepped forward, deeper, as if each bell note loosened her will. I slammed the shutters closed and pressed my palms against my ears, but the sound still crawled through me. The journal's instructions came back to me then. Stuff your ears with wool or wax when the bells sound underwater. I tore strips from an old sweater and jammed them into my ears, the world dimming instantly. It didn't silence the bells entirely, but it dulled them, weakening that strange pull. I sat in the center of my kitchen, candlelight trembling against the walls, waiting for the tolls to fade. When they finally did, the silence that followed felt heavier than the sound itself. I waited until morning before I dared peek outside. Mrs. Hanley's door was wide open, her home flooded knee-high, but she was gone. The water in the street was still, as though nothing had happened, but the faint impression of bare footprints led straight toward the harbor. The following week, the bells returned. This time, I was ready. Wool stuffed in my ears, shutters locked tight. I sat by the fireplace and tried to focus on the steady crackle of wood burning. But even through the muffled haze, the bells seemed to worm their way into my skull, carrying something with them. Not just sound, but whispers, low and urgent. I couldn't make out the words, but they felt personal, as if whoever, or whatever, was beneath the water knew me by name. I bit down on my sleeve until my jaw ached, refusing to move. Eventually, the whispers faded, and with them, the tolls. Now I know the truth. The bells don't just lure you into the water, they bind you to it. Once you hear them without protection, they will always call for you, no matter how far you try to run. I've heard of villagers who left, moving miles inland, only to wake one night to the sound of tolling in their dreams, their bodies already walking toward the nearest shore before they realized what was happening. Wool, wax, whatever you can find, it's your only shield. Rule 7 isn't about comfort, it's about survival, and survival here means silencing the one sound that wants to claim you more than the tide itself. The first time it happened, I thought it was just a stray branch tapping against the glass. The night was still, but the air was heavy, the kind of damp cold that seeps into your clothes and clings to your skin. I sat at my desk with the lamp on, reading through the old tide charts, when I heard it 3 slow, deliberate knocks. Each one was spaced evenly apart, with a hollow weight to them, like knuckles pressing into the wood from the outside. I froze. My window faces the shoreline, and at high tide, the water comes almost halfway up the wall. There's no walkway out there, no ladder, and certainly no reason anyone should be knocking. The journal's handwriting in the margin came back to me. 3 knocks mean they've found you. The light draws them closer. At the time, I didn't know who they were or what, but instinct told me not to ignore it. I reached up and clicked the lamp off. The room fell into shadow, leaving only the faint silver glow of moonlight bleeding through the curtains. The knocking stopped immediately. My heartbeat slowed, though not by much, and I sat there in the dark for what felt like an hour, listening to the muffled slosh of the tide outside. The second time, I made the mistake of hesitating. I'd been writing a letter, the lamplight pooling across the paper, when the knocks came again, slow, patient, as if whoever was outside knew I'd hear them. I glanced toward the curtains, and this time, I swear I saw the shadow of a hand behind the fabric. Not a normal hand, though. The fingers were far too long, bending slightly in the wrong places, the tips tapering into something sharp. My skin prickled as the knocks came again, and before I could think, I switched off the lamp. The darkness swallowed the shadow instantly. But as my eyes adjusted, I noticed something worse, the faint outline of a face pressed against the glass. It wasn't a face you could mistake for human. The eyes were too far apart, glinting with a dull, wet sheen, and the mouth was far too wide, curling upward as though amused. It didn't move when I stared at it, only held its place, as if waiting for the light to return. I stepped back slowly, keeping my gaze locked on the shape until the moonlight shifted, and it melted into the night. Now I understand the real danger. The light doesn't just let them see you, it invites them. It's a signal, a beacon in the dark, telling whatever waits in the water exactly where to come knocking. The journal's final note under Rule 8 was blunt. If you see them once, they will return. If you let them see you twice, you will join them. So now I keep my evenings dim, lit only by candles I can snuff out in an instant. If the knocks come, I sit in complete darkness, breathing slow, counting the seconds until I hear them slide away into the tide. Because here, light is not safety. It's bait, and you don't want to know what bites. You might think it's just the wind the first time you hear it. The cliffs around here have a way of bending sound, carrying it in strange ways from the village or the open water. But the voice that came that night wasn't like any I'd heard before. It was past midnight, the ocean's breath slow and heavy in the dark, and I was finishing my lighthouse log when I heard my name drift up from the shoreline below. At first I froze, thinking maybe someone had been caught by the tide and needed help. The voice carried that faint urgency you can't ignore. I stepped toward the door without thinking. Then it came again, the exact same words, the same pitch, the same pause between syllables. Not just similar, identical. It was as if the sound itself had been caught in a loop. That's when I remembered the margin note under Rule 9 in the old journal I'd found my first week here. They will use your name because it's the one thing you'll always want to answer. They don't need the door, they need permission. I stood with my hand hovering over the latch, torn between instinct and dread. Then the voice changed. This time, it wasn't just my name, it was my father's voice speaking it. Warm, familiar, the exact tone I hadn't heard since before he died. The sound wrapped around me like a memory I could step back into. My fingers twitched, nearly unlatching the door before another thought broke through. My father had never set foot on this island. The third call didn't come from below. It came from right outside the balcony, just beyond the glass. I could almost see the shape of someone standing there in the dark, the faintest outline against the moonlit water. My body screamed to move, to shut the curtains, but the journal's warning played in my mind over and over. If you speak back, you open the door. If you open the door, you'll see what wears the voice. I stayed silent, my breathing shallow, as the voice tried again and again. My name, my father's, a friend from years ago. Each one perfect, each one stolen from my memories. When it realized I wasn't going to answer, the tone shifted. The warmth curdled into something cold and wet, like the sea itself was trying to speak. The last time it called, I could hear water dripping between each word. Then the footsteps started, slow, deliberate, circling the base of the lighthouse. They kept going until the first light of dawn touched the horizon, and only then did the sound fade. I didn't open the door until the sun was high enough to burn the shadows from the rocks. The journal's last line for Rule 9 was etched in a different hand, deeper and rougher than the rest. If it knows your name, it already knows where you are. If you answer, you'll learn where it lives, but you won't come back to tell anyone else. Mirrors aren't just glass here. They're doors, thin, fragile doors that don't always open to the place you expect. In the daylight, they seem harmless enough. You can shave in them, check for salt stains on your uniform, maybe catch a glimpse of the gulls circling outside. But once the sun dips below the water, and the oil lamps become the only light in the tower, mirrors start to reflect more than what's in the room. I learned this my second month on duty. There's an old dressing mirror in the storage room at the base of the stairs. Tall, heavy, with a gilt frame eaten through by rust and sea salt. I never thought much about it until one night when I went down to fetch a new logbook. I passed the mirror without looking, but in the corner of my eye, the reflection didn't match my pace. It lagged behind, just slightly, as if it were watching me go. I froze. Slowly I turned my head, expecting to see my own face staring back. Instead, I saw myself still walking, a perfect copy moving forward in the reflection, while I stood motionless in the real room. The copy stopped, only when it reached the edge of the glass, pressing its palm against the inside of the mirror. I didn't move, didn't breathe, as it leaned forward until its forehead nearly touched the glass. That's when I noticed the eyes. They weren't mine. They were darker, deeper, like looking into the open mouth of a cave. A whisper came from the mirror, faint but close, as if the glass itself were speaking. It said my name once, then again, each time softer, more coaxing. I remembered the rule in the logbook, the part underlined twice. If it speaks, never answer. If it knocks, never knock back. The reflection smiled, though my own lips stayed still. Then came a sound like fingernails scraping the inside of the glass, slow and deliberate. When I finally tore my gaze away, I grabbed an old sheet from a crate and covered the mirror without daring to look again. Later I asked the old keeper about it. He told me the mirrors in the lighthouse hold on to things, not just images, moments, people, even things that don't belong here. He said once the sun sets, the glass stops reflecting you and starts reflecting what's looking for you. If it ever smiles first, you've already looked too long. Now I keep every mirror draped before the light fades. I don't use them, don't even trust the ones in my pocket watch. Because here, mirrors don't just show the past. Sometimes, they show the place you'll end up if you let whatever's inside pull you through. And I've seen enough to know that once you're on the other side of that glass, the reflection doesn't come back alone. The lighthouse has many floors, most of which a newcomer would expect. The keeper's quarters, the supply level, the machinery room, the lantern room at the top. But there's one place that isn't on any tourist map, not even mentioned in the official blueprints: the sub-basement. It's a squat, damp chamber carved directly into the bedrock beneath the tower, accessible only by a locked hatch in the storage level's floor. The air down there is colder, heavier, and carries the smell of salt mixed with something metallic and sour. Even in the day, it feels wrong. At night, it feels alive. When I first started, the hatch key was one of the items on my issued ring, and like any fresh keeper, I assumed I'd eventually have to go down there for maintenance. That is, until my predecessor, a man named Harlan, who spoke like every word, cost him a tooth, pressed his hand over mine, and said, "That key's not for use, it's for weight. If you ever get the idea to turn it after the third foghorn, you won't come back up." He never elaborated, but I kept his warning in mind. The third foghorn blast happens on certain nights when the weather shifts suddenly, when the sea mist comes rolling in faster than the tide chart predicts. The horn sounds once, deep and long, to signal to nearby ships, then again, sharper, warning of visibility loss. The third is the odd one, slower, with a dragging tone, almost like the air itself doesn't want to let it out. By then the fog has usually swallowed everything outside. The glass in the lantern room goes milky white. The rocks vanish. The wave sound changes, not louder, but closer, like the ocean has crept a few steps inland. It was on such a night that I learned why the rule exists. I had just finished logging the evening's readings when the first horn shook the tower. The second came as I was checking the oil levels. By the time the third blast rolled through, something shifted. It wasn't the floor, not exactly. It was the way the air pulled, the kind of subtle pressure change you feel right before a storm, but it was coming from below. I heard it then, a faint rhythmic thump, like something heavy striking the rock far beneath my feet. At first I thought it was machinery, but the lighthouse machinery doesn't keep a beat. This was deliberate, like footsteps, slow and patient. Curiosity is the most dangerous trait for a keeper, but it's also the hardest to kill. I found myself unlocking the hatch before my better judgment could stop me. The hinges groaned, exhaling a draft that smelled older than the sea itself. My lantern barely lit the narrow staircase, spiraling downward, but I went anyway. The steps were slick with condensation. Each one seemed to hum faintly under my boots. The deeper I went, the louder the sound became, Not just thumping now, but voices. Not full words, just a low layered murmur, like several people whispering into cupped hands. My grip tightened on the lantern. I should have turned back right there. The stairs ended at a small landing with a single metal door. The paint was peeling, revealing streaks of something black and oily beneath. It wasn't rust. It glistened too much. There was no handle, just a latch with a heavy bolt that looked recently oiled, which was strange, considering Harlan had told me no one ever came down here. I lifted the bolt. The moment it clicked free, the murmurs went silent. The kind of silence that isn't empty, but watching. My ears rang with the absence of sound. Inside, the sub-basement was smaller than I'd imagined, maybe 12 feet across, but the ceiling was high, lost in shadow. The walls weren't brick or stone, like the rest of the lighthouse. They were smooth, almost polished, and damp, as if something had been breathing on them. In the center of the room sat a square pit, maybe 4 feet on each side, its edges lined with more of that black substance. My lantern's light didn't penetrate the darkness inside the pit. It was too thick, too solid. Then came the tapping. 3 sharp taps from inside the pit, like knuckles on wood, though there was nothing wooden down there. I took an involuntary step closer, peering over the edge. The darkness moved. Slowly, a shape began to form. A face, pale and wrong, like it had been sketched from memory rather than seen. The features shifted too much. Eyes too far apart, mouth too wide, jaw too narrow. And yet, it wore my expression. It tilted its head in the same way I did, mirroring me perfectly. Then it whispered. The voice was mine, but hollow, stretched, with a slight echo. "Come down and see." My foot shifted toward the edge before I caught myself. The pull was almost physical, like invisible hands guiding me forward. I stumbled back, my lantern's flame guttering. That's when the thing's smile broke too wide, splitting into the cheeks, teeth glinting in the flicker. The whispers returned, louder now, overlapping until they filled the entire room. I could make out fragments, lower, closer. "You're already halfway." The air grew heavier, pressing on my chest, and the walls seemed to lean inward. I bolted. The moment my foot hit the first stair, the metal door slammed shut behind me, with a sound like a wave crashing against stone. The murmurs didn't fade. They chased me up the steps, a rising tide of voices speaking in unison. I didn't look back. When I finally reached the hatch, I threw it shut and locked it twice. I didn't notice until later that my hands were trembling so badly I'd dropped the lantern halfway up. I'd climbed most of the way in darkness without realizing it. The next morning, Harlan found me sitting by the hatch, still holding the key in my fist, like a lifeline. He didn't scold me. He just knelt, checked the lock, and nodded to himself. "They like the sound of the horn," he said quietly. "It tells them the sea's coming closer, but they're not the sea." "Not exactly. You gave them a look at you tonight. Next time they'll remember your face." Now when the third foghorn blast sounds, I don't move from the lantern room. I don't even go near the storage level, and I keep that hatch key, but not for opening. For the weight in my pocket, a reminder that some doors are meant to stay shut. Because whatever lives in that pit, it waits for the fog to hide the shore, for the horn to call it awake. And if you give it enough of a reason to climb, it won't need the stairs to reach you. I knew this was the last barrier between me and whatever fate the sinking village had been whispering about all along. Rule 12, as old Anna had once told me in that smoke-filled kitchen, was the final commandment: never step into the water after the bells stop ringing. It wasn't just a warning. It was a death sentence wrapped in folklore. The bells marked the end of the safe hours, a thin thread keeping something unspeakable on the other side. I had never imagined I would be the one standing at the edge, staring at black water lapping against the cobblestones, wondering if I could risk ignoring it. But tonight the village was quieter than it had ever been, and I could feel the rules closing in like the walls of a trap. I had followed every step until now, bending my life into the shape these ancient laws demanded. But with the sinking happening earlier than usual, and the bells ringing out in a frantic, uneven rhythm before cutting off completely, I knew something was different. I could still hear movement out there, faint splashes, a subtle current tugging at the edges of my sanity, and it made me think about all the faces I'd never seen again after hearing that sound. The ground beneath my feet was slick from the creeping tide, and even in the fading light, I saw shapes beneath the surface, moving in a way that was wrong for fish or any living thing I knew. Still, I couldn't look away. Something deep inside whispered that the truth was there, in the water, waiting. That whisper was dangerous, and I knew it. I had seen what happened to people who let curiosity replace caution. They said the water could mimic voices, that it could make you believe someone you loved was calling you from just beyond the shallows. I had dismissed those tales as half-drunk superstition until tonight, when I heard my father's voice, clear, desperate, and calling my name from just beyond the first row of submerged houses. He had died long before I came to the village, and yet there he was in the dark, speaking in the exact cadence I remembered. My legs trembled, and I thought about how easy it would be to take one step forward, to see if maybe, just maybe, the rules were wrong. But the memory of Anna's hand gripping mine, her knuckles white as she hissed Rule 12 into my ear, pulled me back from the brink. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of salt and something else, something metallic, like rust or blood. The tide rose faster than I had ever seen, and the air seemed to grow heavier, pressing down on my chest until breathing felt like work. My lantern light caught on something drifting past, a pale, bloated face that dissolved into nothing when I blinked. The water was playing tricks, but the longer I watched, the less I trusted my own senses. I thought I saw a row of people standing waist deep, their heads tilted back as though listening for something above the surface. None of them moved, and yet I could feel their attention snap toward me the instant my gaze settled on them. The village had always been strange, but now it felt like the rules weren't just protecting us. They were protecting something else from us, or maybe protecting us from ourselves. I turned away, forcing myself to retreat toward the narrow path that wound up to my cottage, but every step felt slower, heavier, as though the water was already clutching at my ankles. Then I heard it again, my father's voice, joined by another softer one I hadn't heard in years, my sister's. They were both calling for help, their voices overlapping, urgent, begging. My resolve cracked, just for a moment, and I glanced back over my shoulder. The figures in the water were closer now, though I hadn't seen them move. Their mouths hung open, and the sound of the voices was pouring out of them. I realized with cold clarity that the voices weren't coming from my family. They were coming from whatever stood out there in the dark, waiting for me to take the final step. The bells had been silent for long enough that the night air felt ancient, thick with something older than the village itself. My skin prickled with the sense that I was standing at the edge of a bargain, one I had never agreed to, but had been born into the moment I took up residence here. I thought about how all the rules had been designed to keep me alive, but also to keep me ignorant. What would happen if I broke this one? Would I finally see what lurked in the depths, or would I simply vanish like the others? The shapes in the water leaned forward in unison, and I knew that if I didn't turn away now, I would never turn away again. My hands shook, my chest ached, but I forced my feet to move. I didn't stop until the water was a distant hiss behind me, its voices fading into something I could almost believe was the wind. But even now, sitting at my table with the shutters bolted and the lantern burning low, I can hear the faintest sound beneath the floorboards, like water seeping through unseen cracks. The rules have kept me alive, but they've also left me wondering if survival is just another kind of captivity. I know I'll follow Rule 12 again tomorrow, and the night after, and every night until the village finally claims me in its tide. Yet part of me will always wonder what would have happened if I had stepped forward, if I had let the water take me when it called my name. The bells will ring again tomorrow, and I'll wait for them to stop, and maybe one night, when I'm tired of surviving, I won't wait at all.